Hi, everyone. It's brilliant that there's been such a huge response to this evening's event hosted by Lighthouse Bookshop. We're going to be discussing Gay Bar, Why We Go Out by Jeremy Atherton Lin. Jeremy is with us, with me tonight on screen at least. After you've tasted some of our Scots hospitality, Jeremy, I hope you'll be able to come back and see us in person, given time, of course. My name is Bob Orr, and I'm co-founder of Lavender Menace Queer Books Archive, which grew out of Lavender Menace Bookshop in the 80s and 90s. And we'll be chatting about this unique book about gay men's culture, history, and sexual escapades, much of which will be left to your imagination. A very warm welcome to you, Jeremy, and congratulations on your first book.
Thank you, Bob, and thank you, Lighthouse. It's nice to be in Edinburgh.
Yeah, indeed. Reaching hands across 400 miles virtually.
Yeah, nice. I wish I was there.
Great. So you're going to start off by reading a couple of passages from your book.
Yeah. The nightlife stretch of Santa Monica Boulevard in West Hollywood hummed like a neon tube. Bright pink shops sold homoerotic mugs and magnets. The party atmosphere was entrenched but subdued. Groups of gays gossiped al fresco over amaretto sours. West Hollywood, incorporated as its own city in 1984, had been dubbed the Gay Camelot and then officially marketed as the Creative City in an effort to draw not just gay bar tourists, but design aficionados. Creative was a way to connote gays zhuzhing up the place. Gays were thought to be especially well adapted to post-industrial economy, experts in leisure and aesthetics. A 1985 issue of Urban Geography put it this way: gay people emphasize exchange value. In other words, their hype and flourish raise costs for everyone else. In actuality, the organizing principle in establishing West Hollywood cityhood had been a push for strict rent control. Ultimately, anyway, nobody referred to it as the Creative City. It was Boys Town. I didn't have a fake ID yet, so mostly the bars were just background noise. Come to think of it, the first gay threshold I crossed must have been that coffee house on the boulevard. It buzzed like a normal cafe with intermittent shrieking. Matthias and I joined some other students he knew. They wore sweatshirts rolled above the wrist. I could tell right off the most amiable by far was Oliver, a tall black dancer with soft black skin who had the habit of smoothing his eyebrow with his middle finger, palm fanning out. He smiled at me slyly, his eyes kind even as he angled his face at a lordly oblique. Taller still was a chiseled sophomore who carried himself with the indignance of a politician's son. There were older men at our table and adjoining, with raw sausage fingers groping cigarettes and stubble as dense as sand. They cackled UCL gay, meaning homosexuals abounded. I'd so far only heard the other crack: University of Caucasians lost among Asians. I was the butt of both of these jokes, but had little attachment to either distinction. Still, a part of me flinched at being corralled into a punchline. The guys at the table seemed so confident, jaded already. They sat with impudent elbows and ankles. I heard it said that the gays were perpetually adolescent, but I was convinced this particular sampling had never been boys in the first place. They assessed instead of greeted. They laughed like they'd already butt-fucked. They looked down long noses with the pride of a man with an ass made only for fucking, as if there never was shit. They used phrases like fresh meat as they recrossed their legs. They spoke as if words were handed to them to disgrace. They were swishy, not mincing, but like a sword slicing air. They were satisfied with cliché. They dismissed whole populations with one sting. Bottoms and tops were fixed positions. To have a clear racial preference was a highly amusing character trait. It became a part of their repertoire of innuendos. If someone liked black men, for instance, he goes to catch one was all that needed to be said. And then this is a few pages down the line. I could no longer make another excuse not to visit my father's friends, a large Chinese family from Taipei who'd resettled in an Orange County suburb dominated by their extensive network of evangelicals. I agreed to attend Sunday dinner at the home of someone in their congregation. A part of me looked forward to it. These Chinese family gatherings were chaotic and wholesome, no alcohol, just a lot of interruption and gadgets. Then a prayer before eating. I'd be grilled, but for once wouldn't be drunk. I hoped some of the progeny were still young enough to play children's games to occupy me. The doorbell was a familiar suburban two-tone, not a hard buzz like in the city. At the euphonious sound, I decided to enjoy myself. I was about to have a secret again, to remember what it feels like to move through a space like a nice young man, normal, nothing other than what is expected of a good university student. I took off my shoes and placed them along all the others, toddler sandals, teenage sneakers, the tiny loafers of senior citizens. From the kitchen came vinegar smells and the sound of sizzling. I was introduced to this auntie and that uncle, terms broadly used for elders. The oldest of them displayed no interest in me whatsoever because I was not kin. They tut-tutted at one another's maneuver in the kitchen or poorly chosen item of clothing. There was much simultaneous lecturing. Eventually, one of the older boys brought me upstairs to a bedroom. It was lit only by a desk lamp and glowing fish tank. A teenager sat there who hadn't come downstairs all evening. Something about his bearing told me it would be rude to look at him directly. I glimpsed the lower half of his face, covered in scar tissue, which amassed on one side, so there was little distinction between jaw and neck. I then felt ashamed for not looking at him directly. His hair was orange from sun in. He smiled, but it appeared involuntary, or mocking, or both. He gave the impression of being self-contained, a little jaded. He interacted lightly with the boy who brought me in, muttering bits of Mandarin. His sideways glances were aimed at the floor. There were drawings and various art supplies on the desk. I scanned photographs on the wall until my eyes came to rest on an uncanny image. A series of prints had been tacked together to form a panoramic stretch of the city blocks. It was the boulevard, the wide sidewalks and skinny trees, boxy stucco shop fronts, beer patios, the neon signs waiting to be switched on. The images had been taken under bright afternoon sun. A few figures were about, young men strutting beneath rainbow flags. There's where Matthias parked in front of the cafe. Around the corner, I fell for the charismatic Rock. Out of the frame to the south was where we went dancing at Studio One. I thought surely a family member who came across this photo montage would decipher the location and be scandalized. But then again, I had learned the codes, knew what type of videos were available at Drake's and what sort of man hung out at Trunks. The boy had taken the photos himself. That much was clear from their consistency with the other images around the room. The gaze was homoerotic, but not at bodies. Details from West Hollywood, signage, street lamps, were rendered monumental. I'd wasted so much energy disparaging the boulevard, castigating it out of a bitterness that I could never truly belong, not attractive enough, not wide enough. The scene confronted me with a gym body ideal, forcing me to look farther afield to figure out what else gay could be and to understand what I was up against. I hadn't considered how it might be something other than a territory to be inside or excluded from, but a geography apart, held in thrall from afar. Santa Monica Boulevard, I blurted. The boy mumbled, I love it there, but to the tune of, obviously. The boy had hung on his wall a real place made mythic, like Proust's Baalbek. I considered how a cultural scene could function not as a box with a clear outside and in, but as a signal, like a searchlight across the sky. He had depicted a landscape. I'd been experiencing the place as a movie set where I was vying for a part. He looked around himself and interpreted, and through that became attached. I was only ever concerned with how I appeared in it, with the stressful situation of men looking at other men. To me, West Hollywood was a state of mind, an attacky one, weho, ugh, but not a unique city that, for all its problems, gay people had built themselves.
Lots of memories for me in those two passages as well. The characters you paint are in the first part are very familiar to me, and I'm sure to many of our audience. Finding somewhere safe was really, although we probably didn't really talk in terms like that, being able to go to a bar and just be yourself was really the most important thing. And the characters that came with the bar were all really part of the adventure.
I went to a coffee shop that was like where everybody I grew up in the Silicon Valley, where everyone went who was like what we called alternative. And so it was like a kind of slightly gothy scene. And it was maybe as welcoming. It was maybe as like inclusive and sort of like messily inclusive as anything I had known, and in a way, as much as anything that I would experience when I started going to like officially gay spaces, because this coffee shop that I read about was like kind of, I mean, it's such a particular thing that I came out in LA though, because it's like Hollywood infiltrates everything. So it's a combination of that, but it was sort of like, it was just kind of catty. And that was the general tone of a lot of gay men to each other. Yeah. So I gone from like places where, to be perfectly honest, like I think a lot of people, and maybe of different generations, have different experiences of like finding a queer safe space. But for me, it's like I had spaces that I was comfortable in. The shock was that when I found spaces that were supposed to be for me, I felt alienated.
Yeah, exactly. I had completely forgotten until I read it about the distinction between active and passive, and all these really sort of oppressive ideas of the way that you had to label yourself somehow to just to be gay. And one of the things that I remember, it was coming out. It's always a long process, and my first relating to your family, the visit to your father's family friend, babysitting for an aunt of mine, and just talking about going to a theatre in Glasgow called the Citizens. It's still there. And she said, "Oh, but I love going to the Citizens. The productions are great," and so they were. But she said, "We never go to the bar because of she remarked about the reek of aftershave from the pretty boys there." And I have to say that I did wear an aftershave when I first came out because everybody else was doing it. But after a while, I sort of left it behind, and I think it was all part of my just finding my own feet, and even in a space like the Waterloo, which was big enough, an old Victorian bar where I used to sell gay news, there would be space for the people who would be catty, as you described, and then they would be the more masculine men. They would be the politicos and what have you. So even in a relatively small bar like the Waterloo in Argyle Street in Glasgow, you could find a space that, fortunately for me at least,
like a bar within a bar.
Yeah. Exactly.
Bob, was the Waterloo the theater bar, or were they two different ones?
No, sorry, they were two different ones. Yeah. There was I've forgotten the name of it, but there was a theatre in the Round. That's right, as well within the Citizens Theatre. Yeah, called the Close Theatre Club. And that's where we all used to congregate. Yeah, but if you wanted to drink from during the interval, you had to go to the Close Theatre Bar for a drink. And it never dawned on me for a minute that my family would be going to the theatre. I didn't think I came from that sort of background. But I didn't say anything else to her about it after that. Great.
Do you think that was a loaded comment that she made about, or do you think?
Yes, perhaps. Yes, I think so. And I never really pursued it, because shortly after that, I left Edinburgh and sort of lost everyday contact with my family on purpose, really, in many ways. So I never pursued it with her. She was a lovely woman.
Yeah, I mean, I think I think there's I was speaking to a writer who had read the book and was he was saying that like my narrator, me as the narrator in the book, it can be a little bit snobby, and especially I think in the scenes where I'm younger, and that is something I very much lean into a little bit. Like I was like Denton Welch was a game changer for me. The way that he like has these like adolescent narrators who are kind of horribly judgmental about the adults around him. But that was really important to me. I'm just thinking about Cologne and the kind of like things that I found off-putting about gay culture, because that is just something that I think a lot of people go through with any kind of identity group that you're meant to be, you've been told that you belong to. There's going to be a kind of rebellion against what you find to be the cliches of that group. But I think also what happens is, and it's just happened to me, and it's just that you just become a bit more forgiving about like that Cologne bomb is like one of many like layers of defense mechanisms that people put, and that's its own kind of judgment. But I think yeah, I just like over time became a little bit more sort of, I don't know, understanding about like where people are coming from, and like how we're not just individuals. We come from what's come before us. And in my case, that was the AIDS, the height of the AIDS crisis. It's like literally started going out the year It's a Sin ends in 1992. So
yeah.
Totally informed by like a kind of defensive self-presentation. Everything looked defensive, sort of was meant to be sort of clean and wholesome and disease-free. And I mean, I guess from Waterloo in the 70s, you'll have seen the sort of before and after of those kinds of cultural transformations because of the.
Yeah, well, yes. The interesting thing about being in a small city as well, I think, is that there was and this idea of finding not wanting to be labeled by the gay scene, as it were, which is what we called it, and this, even given the success of Fire Island in the 80s, high energy, and it was really a very, very successful, internationally known for its, at least for its music and its guests like Divine and the Village People and what have you. So that was the gay place in Edinburgh. But there was a whole bunch of other people, and of course through the 80s there was the whole machinations about AIDS and everything else. But there was, at the same time, in parallel to Fire Island, there was a whole group of gay men that actually mixed with folk that were much more sort of art school types, fashion conscious and conscious of a different sort of music as well, and would mix in clubs in Edinburgh, like Buster Brown's, for example, in Market Street, which is by the railway station. And we used to think that they were actually copping out. It was just a big closet, but actually what they were doing was creating a trend, which is what you talk about in that was happening in Pop Stars in London. And to a certain extent, you really like it, but on the other side of you're saying I can't dance to Britpop, and being a wallflower. Tell us a little bit more about that.
Can I ask you, were you conscious of the fact that it's quite telling that Fire Island was named after an American club, don't you think?
Yeah.
I mean, I think in that time period, I mean, and then later on, there's a club called Village, and a bar called Village in Soho, which is named after like the Village and the Marais, which is named after Greenwich Village. So it's like all goes back to this almost like there's this kind of like soft power American gay identity that was peddled over in that era. I think it's no coincidence. Yeah. Absolutely.
There was a bar called Key West as well for a short while.
Right. Yeah.
And Lavender Menace, of course, comes from it's not a gay reference, it's a lesbian reference, but it's still that soft power, soft political power that America has. Yeah.
Yeah. But as to the sort of alternative scenes, I think it's very easy, in the moment to kind of feel like the version of an alternative that you have found, or in the case of you through your own club have created, is sort of the answer, I suppose, because everybody's looking for a place where maybe you belong if you don't belong elsewhere. And I think, well, Pop Stars is so meaningful to me, but I was a little bit critical of it looking back, just because you have that hindsight of 30 years, and Pop Stars have been, like 20 years. So I mean, it was a little bit of a kind of, it was surprising to me to look back and think what was like the gay indie scene was sort of just kind of basically aping mainstream, what had become mainstream straight culture, like Oasis, like they play Oasis. It's kind of crazy to think like but we thought we were different. And I think, and you make these decisions, and I think, again, it's like, I don't want to pass judgment on the way that we navigate the world, because we just do what we do. But like, we were kind of, around that time, well, there's a big presence of Attitude magazine for a little bit in that chapter that you're speaking about, because it's I was kind of shocked to go back and look at the early issues, because they were peddling this message that it was a little bit phobic, and because they were peddling this message that like there was a kind of aesthetic that was sort of desirable, that wasn't like a cliche gay masculinity. It was like a David Bowie, Mick Jagger kind of like fey, but like basically kind of ultimately sort of heteronormative aesthetic. And that was really interesting to me. Like, I spent quite a few days in the British Library revisiting those magazines, and you have to go to that section, even though they're not that racy, but you have to go to that section of the British Library where it's like a sensitive materials section, and you're not allowed to take pictures of them, and you're like sitting right under the gaze of the librarian. But stacks and stacks of it. And I think it was, again, I think it's something that was quite well intentioned at the time in terms of trying to break norms, but like relying on, I don't know, I suppose it's hard to create something new, so you fall back on like something that exists. And in that case, it was this very like sort of David Bowie aesthetic. Yeah,
we sold Anti-Gay in Western Wild, which was the successor to Lavender Menace, and it was quite controversial. People would bring it up to the counter saying, why are you selling this book? Without even looking at its contents. And we weren't going to censor anything. But again, you see, I think there's this, where you're coming from is a big city milieu where there's you can pick and choose the places to go, and what you're telling us is a personal story as well.
Yeah, definitely.
As well as trying to relate that to a wider cultural changes. Yeah. In my the story that I have about the early 90s is that music changed. Fire Island closed in 1989, I think, something like that. And even before it closed, the music had changed there too. And the irony of it was that Fire Island, where Lavender Menace had started off, just as a quick byline, by selling books in the cloakroom, and raising enough money to be able to open a shop a proper bricks and mortar shop. The irony of it in 1989 was the owner sold the building to Waterstones.
Right.
And it's still at Waterstones to this day. Yeah. But at the same time, house music was coming along, and there were recreational, the sort of rise of recreational drugs and that sort of thing. And I went into partnership with another gay man and a couple of heterosexual DJs and opened a house dance club called Taste on a Sunday night, which was a night after the weekend was over. You either got drunk on a Friday and had sex on the Saturday, or so then you could relax on the Sunday, and lots of people didn't work on a Monday, so it worked really well. But its strapline was for extroverts and perverts, and the thinking behind it was that your sexuality wasn't an issue. And for us, what that meant was that we could attract I hate this sort of dichotomy between gay and straight, but nevertheless, the reality was that there was a whole straight scene that was actually under siege by football casuals at the time. And it was, for them, particularly for straight men, it was actually quite dangerous to go out. And our door policy was very tight, and the idea was that violence was left at the door, then you could come in and enjoy yourself. And this attracted a whole bunch of people who found themselves mixing with gay men and a few lesbians as well. And we were all having a great time. And it really, really popular. But in a small city like Edinburgh, there was still, of course, the gay bars to go to, and the disco floor in CC Blooms and what have you, and the bunch of folk that were going to Buster Brown's they've shifted across to Taste. So there was an ongoing development that way, and for us it was of course by this time I'd been out for several years, so I was perfectly happy with my own gayness. What I found actually difficult was working with and being in the company of straight men, because I'd lived in a little bubble for quite a long time. Let me have a look at my notes. Yes, so you've talked about pop stars. That's right. I'm glad you did that, because you said it went on for 20 years. The guy who ran Pop Stars died of, well, he collapsed on he opened up a permanent venue, amongst other things, and another bar in Soho. I mean, he was quite an entrepreneur for his time, and then he collapsed and died at one night after he was at one of his venues. And that, I don't. It's no secret, and it made a lot of the press, and there was I read I read like a kind of almost like a version of an autopsy and everything like that when I was researching the book, and I think, yeah, I mean, that to me was a bit of it's kind of emblematic of some of the decision making I made in this book about how, because it's like, I am just like in these rooms observing people, and there's a tension there that's about trying to figure out which stories are contributing to the story that I'm kind of trying to tell, and then that was a real struggle for me, whether or not to include his death in the book, because I felt at a certain point that I just had this instinct that it didn't belong to me. I mean, I'm happy to talk about it in conversation because it's just out there. It's a publicly known thing, but it just didn't feel like it belonged to me. It felt kind of pathologizing, like, or that was meant to carry a kind of like weight about potentially alcoholism, or but
Yeah, so that was an interesting kind of dilemma for me. But then what happened structurally is also is that I think pretty much if you go through the middle chapters of the book, like everything that happens within those chronologies is pretty self-contained. It flips around time a lot, but it's always kind of like that moment and then the past, rather than it doesn't go into the future. And that kind of wound up being the deciding factor. But yeah, he wound up having quite an influence on sort of alternative gay culture in London, and then that set a big precedent to like clubs in, like there's a club called Misshapes in New York that was influenced by that, and clubs in Barcelona. I mean, he was like, yeah, he had an influence, and I think he was an important player. But yeah, all of these places, it's like these judgment calls about what to include.
Yeah. So the interesting thing for me is that what I was getting this tension from you in the book about whether you really, as an observer, you were noting certain things, but you were also enjoying and taking advantage of the venues as well. And why not? And so I take it then, as time went on, the tension, the sort of balance, the pros and cons of going out were you met them in a particular way that you could. I mean, were you always an observer, or did you have this book in mind for a very, very long time?
I mean, I think there's a kind of there's a moment in San Francisco where I talk about kind of like, almost like going out to, I have a line in the book about how I went out to create content. Like I was really influenced by Eileen Miles and Michelle T, and before, and the writers who influenced them, like even to an extent, like Bukowski. Like I'm not like a huge into Bukowski, but whatever. I kind of bought into a little bit the myth of like sort of like living a bit rough in order to like create content to write about. And then so it was really kind of like intertwined, if that makes sense. So yeah, I mean, I always feel like a wallflower. I mean, I imagine that a lot of people just do. Like, I feel like a wallflower, but at the same time, like, whatever. I've like danced on a tabletop, or but yeah, I mean, I think it's been interesting to like when there's been moments where like, I don't know, like, I started I was like more doing like zines and blogs and stuff like that. And then like I had a couple of things published, whatever. And then like, it's a strange thing because people feel like they have a kind of like a right to, like, I remember somebody coming up to me in a bar and asking me to like, me and my partner to make out for him because I had written about sex publicly. Like he felt like he had that sense of ownership, which is like, fine. That's whatever, that happened. But I think it is a bit of a strange thing too, when people don't like, there's also a kind of presumption, I think, when people read the book, that I'm like expressing some like true essential self, which I just kind of like don't really believe in the first place, that they're like, I think we're very contingent beings, and like we're read different ways, and we read ourselves in different ways at different times and moments. And so it's a bit funny, like now I've had to do a bit of a interview like junket with the book release of the book, and people are like kind of like sort of keep sort of asking me about like my opinions and stuff. And I think that the narrator in the book is very undecided, and like also just like not, it's just like a one version of me, if that makes sense.
Yeah. That's interesting. You should talk about San Francisco, because you write very personally about how about the evolution of your identity when you start to use the word fag, and you stop using deodorant, and on the thesis of your book as being how we develop our identity is related to the spaces that we go to.
Mm.
How much did those spaces influence you, or was it the other way around?
Oh yeah, no, yeah, definitely. I mean, I wrote a zine in that sort of moment, which was like 2000s, and
Yeah.
I went back and read it, you know, like like it was almost like self-researching, you know, for the book, and I took a lot of facts that, I mean, there's stuff that I'm so glad that I had documented at the time. Like, I was hanging out at this bar and feeling like I was kind of like starting to mature because I was like approaching 30, and the bar had a clock on the wall that had my birth year stamped on it. Like details like that I wouldn't have remembered. I mean, I have a pretty good memory actually, which is one of the reasons I'm able to use memoir as a strategy in my writing. But like there's details like that that definitely come from that zine that I wouldn't have remembered otherwise. But yeah, I mean, I make these comments in that zine where I was just already obsessed with like how I am a part of the places that I hang out in, and I mean, and then that moment in San Francisco would be quite scuzzy, like just dives basically, and they were like considered neighborhood bars. I mean, that might be kind of considered comparable to Buster Brown's, and it would be almost comparable to like a pub that was taken over in the UK, right, versus like this corporation had come in and like branded a gay bar, you know, and they were so important to me, and like yeah, they wme like a little stinky in like a kind of natural way, and I think I'm somebody, this it's so hard for me to imagine what it would be like to be somebody who feels the way that I do about this in this age of the internet, especially like it being like 19 and in lockdown and like only having like sort of like social media basically as your way that you socialize. Is that like I was always a little bit I don't think I really burst into a room with like a fully formed like this is me kind of thing. Like right. People read me in different ways, and sometimes it felt a bit obnoxious and didn't really stick, but sometimes I would just try it on for the night or just for the conversation and see where that went, because, well, sometimes you want to be seen how other people see you. And that experience for me was a lot about finding out who I want to be through like making mistakes and awkward moments with strangers and all that kind of stuff. And that, to me, now I'm just like, that must be hard for that kid, like now, who like everybody seems so fully formed online and branded, kind of, you know.
Yeah. Well, like I guess that's a sort of the falsehood of social media in a sense, is that we all come across as fully formed, as you say. Yeah. Okay, so I'm keeping an eye on the time. I want to talk about your ideas of community. You're at the end of the chapter on London pubs, and you include a really fascinating history about the London Apprentice, which I went to more than once.
Yeah.
You relate a story of being in company back in California. Yeah. When your host enviously talks about the queer community in London being much stronger than the one in LA, in California. I'm quoting here your thoughts on community as piling a confusing identity onto an elusive concept. Mm. And later on you say, the way I interpreted it, at least, was you'd rather see community in the context of bars as people moving in different directions. Mm-hmm. So given that community is this idea of a sort of cohesive group, which you think is it's too amorphous to really talk about too much, why do you then think moving in different directions? I mean, you're talking about the opposite, really, aren't you? It seems to me that a community can be diverse. Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I was thinking a lot about, which I cut from the book because it seemed a little bit whatever. It was sort of difficult for me to handle. But I was reading The Coming Community by Agamben, and that kind of thinking about how he talks about how like language is problematic because you say a tree, but like you might be indicating a spruce or an elm or an oak or whatever like that, but like you still kind of do need the word tree and all this kind of stuff. And you know, I think for me what it is just that for some reason, and I don't know if it's like my particular personality or my particular generation or whatever it is, but like every time I hear the word community, I just bristle a little bit because it always feels like there's something about it that is excluding inherently. It always seems to be announced with a slight smugness, and it always seems to be about it sounds more like you could almost just substitute the word click, and it would be the message that the person is
a very big click. Yeah.
And I definitely get that, like, that's not what a community has to be. Like, I mean, a community can be one of like total plurality and all that kind of stuff. But when it's based on an identity, you know, whatever. I understand the need for these identity groups to articulate them. We need to articulate ourselves politically, for one thing, to make traction, because every identity group has certain things that need to be considered in a very specific way in order to make political progress. But it's just like, there's a part of me, and maybe this is a bit unfashionable, but there's a part of me that just like appreciates the idea of the word community actually really just meaning a sort of like geographical, where you are geographically. Because I think if I think in terms of like, who are my NHS workers who live and work in my area, who's going to take care of me at my GP, what is the person who works down the street at the co-op going through, having to work through the pandemic? How are they dealing with people who are not like following the rules about like, how do we treat each other when we're wearing the like currently, like, what is it when you pass by somebody and you're wearing a mask and you step out of the way, all that kind of stuff. For me, like, just the word community makes a lot of sense, makes more immediate sense to me, in terms of the fact that that's people trying to figure out how to navigate each other. That's not based on a presupposition or what's been called like an imagined community of like being gay. But, you know, I mean, it's whatever, like words, then there is the gay community. Like you can say, you know, whatever. I tend to say population about stuff that have more to do with identity groups.
Right. It's and then moving on to the in a sense, what your chapter, there's a whole part of a chapter on your visit to Blackpool, which, you know, and to me, to a certain extent, that's where community would come in, because particularly because you think that at least your definition of community would also apply, I think, because you talk about working class entertainment being inherently gay. That's my interpretation, at least, and that
sometimes gay entertainment being inherently working class.
You know, that's exactly what I was going to say. Exactly that. Yes, exactly. So there's this interaction between the two, and it fascinates me that that's been the part of parts of the north of England, at least. That's how you know, there's working men's clubs and small bars in places, you know, in neighbourhoods of Leeds and Sheffield and what have you. That sort of I wouldn't say closeness, but that interaction has you know, gone on for as long as I can remember, at least. Do you think that? And yeah, we seem to agree in that. That's a fair assessment of my.
Yeah, I think that I think. Well, I mean, one of the reasons I included that Blackpool bit was because I'm not like a journalist throughout the book. I'm more of a memoirist, and I revisit the places that I know very well. But I wanted there to be a moment where I do that, where I kind of like go, like I'm a tourist, and almost like a journalist in Blackpool, and to be an outsider, like really an outsider, not just like feeling like an outsider, but like really visiting a place. And to see what happens. And I think the sense that I get, I mean, is that a lot of the places that I talk about in the book, San Francisco and LA and London, are like very much concerned with broadcasting themselves to the rest of the world. And that's a real part of like how those cities operate, like how they're constantly beaming themselves outward, and then they're a part of this like international like language system about like the way that we think about concepts of identity and stuff like that. Whereas it seems much more self-contained there, and also like I mean, to the extent where there's like a person in the book who like says, "I'm not gay." Oh wait, I am, and it's like it's just because that word is sort of meaningless to him. Like it's like he isn't like kind of like hitched onto like an international communication system of gayness. It's just like his own experience, and like maybe he is just gay for the night or the weekend or like whatever, people there who just go out on femme, like dressed in cross-dressed for it's like a weekend thing rather than like it's just like a very particular way of experiencing the work week and your local area that's got the gay bars, and like it was brilliant. I mean, absolutely brilliant. I mean, have you been to Blackpool recently?
No, I haven't. No, not recently.
It's
no.
wild.
It's what? It's wild. Did you say?
Yeah, I mean, and it's another place that in the book that has been kind of like taken over by hen parties.
Oh yeah.
But entertainment as means to tolerance. Yeah, but it's like it's just like I don't know, Blackpool.
Mad, yeah. We want to give some time for questions. One of the things I'd like you to, and I was so glad that you talked about it in the book, was this idea of safe spaces. Since coming back into the LGBT communities, put it that way, after retiring from nightlife and working on the archive, I discovered that talk of safe spaces is even more important now. And you talk about rules and risks that we all consider when we go out. And I think maybe bringing in your idea of the disparate parts of the community. Can you say something to a much more diverse group of people some of whom may be watching?
Yeah. I mean, I definitely understand that like a lot of new generation events are like quite structured around like what kind of behavior is appropriate, and that has to do with the fact that there are people who haven't been able to haven't had the maybe because of the bodies that they inhabit or the way that they're perceived by society, haven't been able to take the risks that like just cis men have been able to take. So I totally get that. Those places may need to have sort of borders and boundaries in order for that risk to be able to take place in a way that came a little bit. I was able to just kind of stumble in and experience. But I mean, men are also vulnerable bodies as well. And there's moments there, I end up in the hospital in the book and stuff like that. I mean, I think my main thing my main thing is that I wasn't trying to write about what I think gay bars should be. I just have written about like some of their problematic history. And I think that probably has been maybe a little bit frustrating for people who wanted the book to just be like a celebration of queer spaces. Whereas I'm like, well, this was like, I mean, gosh, they put me on the BBC the other day
Wow.
And that on what's it, the Today Show, they told me at like 7 p.m. that they wanted me to record something really quickly for in the morning, and they wanted it to be about my take on gay anthems, which is like not really, like it's like a version, I guess, that they invented of what I'm talking about. So I did it really quickly. I'm like, Bob, I'm telling you, every comment, like, I mean, I'm very grateful that they put me on and everything, but I would say something like, oh, disco has a reputation for being for like liberation and unity, and then I would say, but there's like racism and sexism on the door, and they would cut that section. They literally cut anything I said that was a bit equivocal out. So I mean, I stand by what went on the air in terms of the fact that it's just like a joyful celebration of like, I'm coming out and I will survive and stuff like that, which is fine. But it was a little bit more depthful what I was trying to say.
Crazy stuff. Yeah, the media takes so much for granted and will distort just for their own agenda. That's great. Thank you so much for that really good conversation.
Thank you, Bob.
You enjoyed it. I hope it meant something to you as well to be able to. So hopefully I can. Yes, here we are. So I've got a question here. You used the phrase messy inclusivity. Do you think that the messy might make it more inclusive rather than a place with any sort of rigid social coding? That's a question to you, yeah.
I'm very pro the kind of sort of unfashionable gay bar that just is like there. And it often is a place where if it's like centrally located, it's a place for people who like at the end of their workday might feel a bit more at ease that they might at the place across the street. And I think that those places do have an opportunity to be messily inclusive just by the very nature of them not announcing a particular agenda or not as much. But I think maybe they do also evolve more slowly. Like they maybe reflect the diversity of the city that they're in, like gradually, rather than like being a superimposed thing. But I'm definitely like, I mean, gosh, I'm totally into like that kind of stumbling into a place and it being a bit chaotic and like not knowing what to expect and all that stuff. But, you know, at the same time, I'm trying to be in those spaces kind of aware of the privileges that I have to, like, you know, I can kind of pass in various situations more than somebody else might be able to. So, yeah.
The next question is there a single scene or is there a collection of micro cultures identified by certain venues and social circles? What are your experiences of different venues that you both felt comfortable or less comfortable in? Thanks, David.
Yeah, I mean, it varies. I don't think it kind of, for me, I don't think it kind of, a particular type of place. Like I have to say, like I have been in kind of men's spaces that on that night I did feel comfortable in, or just sort of horny and like, I like to frisson in the room, but then like generally, I mean, of course, like I like to hang out with people of more broader range of gender self-definitions and like lesbian own spaces, but it totally varies. I mean, there's I don't know. I think it varies according to the night sometimes. But there's places the places that I'm most fond of, like sort of sentimentally in San Francisco. A lot of them tend to be sort of lesbian-owned, sort of mixed.
That's it for tonight, I think. Okay. So,
thank you so much, Bob.
Thank you, Jeremy.
Thank you for being here. Gosh, thank you. Yeah.
Thank you, Jeremy, for a really stimulating conversation. Where are my notes? But we're running out of time, and thank you for being such a brilliant guest, and thank you to our audience and your questions. We could go on all night, but we'll have to leave it there. So until next time, with 3 minutes to go, thank you.